Whispers echo through the high canyons of Bitterroot Ridge of a girl too large to flee, too young to carry what she carries, and the virgin mountain man who took her in without touching her once. They say he spoke just 7 words to her that first night. "By spring, you'll birth my daughter." What did he mean? Who was the girl he lost? And why does he believe this outcast child holds her soul? As winter deepens and the townsfolk gather their pitchforks, only one question matters. Can redemption bloom where no love has ever taken root? When a man with nothing left offers shelter to a girl the world cast out, the mountain begins to whisper of second chances. Who was the sinner? Who was the savior? And what does it mean to be family, if not by blood, then by choice? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories, true or imagined, bind us across miles and seasons. If you believe in dignity, in redemption, in the quiet strength of doing what's right, then you belong here. Tell me which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories that still believe in good. They said she lied. They said she seduced him. They said she wanted attention, wanted sympathy, wanted to tear down a righteous man. But 16-year-old Ruth Ann stood trembling before the elders in the chapel, belly beginning to swell beneath her handmade cotton dress, and said what no one dared say out loud, that Elder Shirtliff had locked the door, that he had touched her where no one ever should, that her body now bore the proof. Her father didn't speak. Her mother wept into her kerchief, not for Ruth, but for the shame. The bishop called her a temptation. The women muttered about gluttony and secrets and sin. That same night, while the frost crawled across the windows, they opened the back door and pushed her out barefoot. Her brother tossed her wool coat after her like it was a heap of manure. Her shoes, they said, belonged to her sister now. She stood stunned in the snow for a long while, cradling her belly with one hand, the too-thin coat with the other. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the door slammed behind her, final as a coffin lid. No one looked back. The street was dark, the lanterns in the chapel now snuffed out. The mountain loomed to the west, jagged and cruel, but it was the only place left where no one would know her name. She turned her face into the wind and walked. Each step burned, then numbed. Her feet left dark, wet impressions on the frozen road. The snow thickened, soft flakes turning to icy needles. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere a door latched. She was not welcome anywhere in town. Every porch she passed seemed to shrink from her. Every window glowed warm against the dark, but no hand opened the door. She was not a daughter anymore. She was not a sister. She was something else now, something shameful, something cast out. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, her limbs ached with cold. The trees opened like a mouth, swallowing her whole. She didn't know where she was going, only that it must be away. She remembered tales of the ridge of the man who lived alone, the giant who hadn't set foot in town for 10 winters, the man they called Bear. They said he'd gone mad after his family died, that he spoke to ghosts and didn't take kindly to trespassers. But Ruth Ann had no ghosts to fear, only the living. The wind howled louder as she stumbled uphill. Her fingers were blue now. Her breath came in sobs. The snow reached her knees. She collapsed once, then again. Her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child inside. "I'll get us there. I will." But the storm had teeth. She didn't see the shape approach, tall and wide-shouldered, draped in a hide coat so dark it blended with the trees. She didn't hear his footsteps over the wind. Only when the warmth of fur brushed her cheek did she flinch. A deep voice, rough as bark and twice as cold, said just one thing before the blackness took her. "You don't belong to them now." The last thing Ruth felt before the dark swallowed her was the warmth of breath against her temple and the scratch of a wool collar beneath her cheek. Then, silence. When she came to, it was the creak of timber and the faint hiss of fire that greeted her. The smell of pine sap, smoke, and iron filled her nose. She lay wrapped in heavy blankets atop a straw mattress, boots stuffed with wool beside the hearth. A kettle hung over low flames, and snowmelt dripped from her lashes. For a long moment, she stared at the ceiling beams, too stunned to move, unsure whether she was still alive. Then came the sound of a boot scraping wood. She turned her head slowly. He stood in the corner, arms crossed, back against the wall. A massive man, broad-shouldered, with tangled black hair that spilled beneath his hat. His beard was wild, streaked with gray, and his coat looked handmade from thick animal hide. In the flickering firelight, his eyes gleamed like river stones, dark, watchful, unreadable. Silas McCrae, the man the town called Bear. Ruth had heard the stories, that he hadn't spoken to a soul in a decade, that he'd once killed a bounty hunter with his bare hands, that he carved his own wife's name into a tree and sat beneath it every Easter like it was her grave. Some said he was a madman. Others whispered he was a saint, but no one dared find out for themselves. He didn't speak. He just watched her, like a hunter watching a doe wary, uncertain whether she would bolt or bite. She sat up slowly, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean to, didn't ask, he said. It wasn't cruel, just final. I'm Ruth, she said after a pause. He didn't answer. She tried again. Thank you for finding me. Still, no reply. She looked down at her hands, at the way they trembled in the heat. I didn't have anywhere else to go. You got now, he said at last, with a slight nod toward the hearth. That was all. The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside it was still. Silent, except for the snap of firewood and the slow breath of a man who hadn't shared air with another soul in years. She tried to read him in the quiet, the lines in his face, the tension in his jaw, the deep furrows between his brows. He was a man built by silence and solitude, not by cruelty. There was pain in his stillness, pain like hers. It sat between them like a third presence. That night, he slept in a chair across the room. He didn't undress her, didn't touch her, except to lift her from the snow. He laid his rifle across his knees, kept the fire alive, and never closed his eyes for long. And in the darkness of the cabin, with the snow blanketing the world outside, Ruth curled beneath a stranger's quilt and felt safer than she ever had in her father's house. Not loved, not forgiven, but safe. The first light of morning seeped through the cabin window, casting a pale gold stripe across the rough floorboards. Ruth stirred beneath the heavy quilt, her limbs still heavy with sleep and pain. Her feet throbbed, raw and red from the snow, but wrapped now in soft strips of cloth that smelled faintly of mint and smoke. The fire still burned, low but steady. The chair where the man had sat through the night was empty. She sat up slowly, wincing as her body reminded her just how close she'd come to freezing to death. Her dress had been replaced with a coarse flannel shirt, far too large for her frame. Her underclothes remained intact, nothing improper, nothing stolen. In fact, it was as if she had been handled like something breakable, something sacred. A moment later, the cabin door creaked open, and he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He carried a bundle of wood in one arm and a steaming tin bowl in the other. The cold clung to him like a second coat, but he moved with the surety of someone who belonged to the mountain more than to men. He didn't speak as he set the bowl on the table, added wood to the fire, and knelt beside the hearth to coax it back to life. Sparks danced, smoke curled. Then, finally, he looked at her. You eat, he said simply. Ruth blinked. Thank you. He nodded once and turned away to the workbench, pulling down a set of jars and flint tools. She approached the bowl, hesitantly, her stomach growling at the scent-thick porridge with wild berries and something like honey. It was hot, real, kind. She ate in silence, watching him from the corner of her eye. He moved like a man used to being alone, efficient, deliberate, wordless. Every tool had its place. Every action had a purpose. When she finished, she set the spoon down and said, I'm Ruth Ann. He didn't look up. Do you have a name? She asked. He exhaled through his nose. Silas, he said. Then after a pause, McCrae. She nodded, trying not to let the quiet bother her. Thank you for saving me. He met her eyes then. I don't save people, he said. I don't take in strays. You got till spring. And she swallowed. Then what? Then you leave. Ruth looked at the floor. All right. No men come here. No talking past dark. No wandering off. She nodded again. All right. He studied her a moment longer, then turned back to his work, but something had shifted. His voice had been gruff, but not unkind. The rules weren't a punishment, they were a shield, built not for his comfort, but maybe for hers. That night, as dusk settled over the mountain, Ruth curled beneath the quilt again. The fire near the hearth burned bright, but sometime before midnight, she opened her eyes and saw something strange. Across the room, in the far corner, a second fire glowed low in a stone pit. He had built it while she slept, so she'd be warm no matter how the wind turned. He said nothing. Neither did she. But the message was clear. She could stay. Not forever, not freely. But for now, she had a place. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as cold as the mountain made him seem. It was while sweeping the corner near the firewood pile that Ruth first saw it. A flash of smooth cedar beneath a mound of stiff old pelts, tucked behind crates and forgotten tools. The edge curved gently, rounded like a smile or a sorrow. She bent down and lifted the hides with both hands, uncovering a small cradle, hand-carved, burnished to a soft glow, and covered in years of dust and silence. She didn't touch it, not at first. Something about it felt sacred. The cradle wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a memory preserved in wood, shaped by calloused hands and vanished hope. There were tiny initials scratched into the underside, too faded to read clearly, and faint floral etchings along the sides, delicate things, painstakingly carved. "Silas?" she called softly, not wanting to intrude. He was on the other side of the cabin, sharpening a blade at the grindstone. He didn't answer at first, didn't look up, but she saw the tension in his shoulders tighten like a pulled cord. She turned back to the cradle. "Did you make this?" Still silence. "I didn't mean to pry." His knife hit the bench with a clatter. The room stiffened around them. Ruth turned slowly, expecting anger, but what she saw on his face wasn't rage. It was something worse, a raw, shuttered grief, too old to cry and too deep to name. He stared at her like she'd spoken the name of the dead out loud. He said nothing, just walked past her without a word, pulled his coat from the wall, and stepped out into the snow. Ruth watched the door sway behind him, a flurry of cold rushing in before it shut tight. He didn't return by sundown. She kept the fire alive, tended to her bandages, and made tea with dried mint she found in the cabinet. She placed a bowl on the table for him, untouched. Dark fell. Wind scratched at the windows. Still, no sign of him. She sat in his empty chair, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the cradle, wondering whose it had been, wondering what name had once been sung to sleep in it, wondering what kind of man carved something so tender and then buried it beneath hides, like it could be forgotten. When she finally dozed off, it was to the sound of distant, rhythmic thudding. In the hours before dawn, she rose and peeked through the frost-laced window. Out beyond the cabin, in a clearing lit by moonlight, Silas stood shirtless despite the cold, axe swinging in great arcs, sweat steaming off his back. He split log after log with mechanical precision, his movements hard and endless, as though something inside him had burst open and could only be kept at bay by the rhythm of labor. He didn't stop, not when the wind bit harder, not when his breath came ragged. The pile of wood grew taller. He never once looked at the cabin. Ruth watched him until her eyes blurred, then returned to her blanket. The image of him burned into her mind. He was a man trying not to remember, and she, without meaning to, had reminded him. The days passed in silence, measured by the soft crackle of the fire and the hiss of melting snow. Ruth kept to the quiet rhythm of the cabin, learning its corners and its moods, reading its language through the way the light bent at certain hours, or the sound Silas made when he moved through it, never sudden, never loud, always necessary. She spoke little, but she worked. Her hands, once swollen and clumsy from cold, had grown steadier. She tended the hearth, scrubbed the floor with melted snow and lye, and sorted what remained of last autumn's root cellar. One morning, she found a sack of flour tucked behind a barrel of salted pork. It was coarse, a little weevil-bitten, but still good. She drew water from the snow bucket, added pinches of salt from the clay crock, and began to knead dough on the slab of counter-worn smooth from years of use. Her hands moved in slow, sure circles, pressing and folding, folding and pressing. As she worked, she began to hum not a song she knew by name, just something that rose up from her chest, wordless and low, the way her mother used to hum when she peeled apples in the evening light. She didn't think Silas was listening. He was outside, splitting the last of the cedar logs. But halfway through the loaf, she noticed the rhythm of his axe had stopped. When she glanced through the crooked window, he was standing still, blade in hand, watching her, not intruding, not glaring, just watching. A man listening to a sound he hadn't heard in years and wasn't sure he trusted. That night, they ate the bread together. He didn't praise it, didn't even nod, but he ate 3 thick slices and buttered the 4th. Ruth didn't need more than that. The next morning, he was gone. She woke to find his coat missing from the peg and his rifle absent from its place above the door. Snow clung to the boot prints leading down the ridge trail, already half filled by wind. She paced the cabin, uncertain if he'd left for good or if she'd somehow broken the delicate truce between them. Her hands hovered over the cradle once, then pulled away. She didn't want to disturb the past again. He didn't return by dusk, but in the pale hours of morning, as the frost receded from the window panes, the door creaked open, and there he stood, wind-burned and stiff, carrying a small burlap sack in one hand and a branch wrapped in beeswax cloth in the other. He set it on the table between them without a word. When she peeled back the cloth, her breath caught. Honeycomb, golden, thick, and glistening, wild, unbought, fresh from the hives that nested deep along the cliffs. She looked up at him, eyes wide, hands trembling. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Instead, she sliced a small piece of bread, drizzled it with the golden syrup, and placed half on a plate in front of him. He took it without looking at her, but he ate it slow, as though the taste reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time, the silence between them felt full, not empty, not tense, full like the hush that follows prayer. They were not friends. They were not family, but they were no longer strangers. That was enough. The birch trees stood tall and pale beyond the ridge, their bark peeling like old skin, smooth and white beneath the wind's touch. Ruth had never seen birch before she came to this mountain. Back in town, the trees were thick-trunked cottonwood, heavy and dull. But up here, they shone like ghosts, quiet, slender witnesses to things unspoken. On the 3rd week of her stay, Ruth began to peel pieces from the downed branches Silas gathered for kindling. Not much, just enough to dry beside the fire, flatten under the skillet's weight. She needed something to put her thoughts on. Paper felt too formal, too fragile. Birch was different, coarse, grainy, real. She used a charred stick to write, at first, simple prayers. Lord, keep the fire burning. Let the storm pass. Watch my child. Then she added sketches, small outlines of cabins, mountains, cradles, stars, things she didn't know how to say aloud, things that might float too far if they weren't pinned down. She slipped the birch slips into the cracks of the cabin wall, behind jars on the shelf, under the wool where she slept. Not to hide them, exactly, but to offer them, to the cabin, to the silence, to him. She wasn't sure when he started finding them. But one evening, while sweeping, she discovered one returned to her place, at the hearth, her own drawing of a single tree, now bearing a single word beneath it, written in the same ash-smudged black. Stay. It wasn't a command. Not from him. It was more like a suggestion, tentative, quiet, written not with authority but with a trembling sort of hope. She stared at it for a long time, her hand hovering over the bark as if to touch it too hard might make the word disappear. She didn't show him she'd seen it. That was his language. Silence, half-mended with small offerings. Later that night, while folding the wool blanket near the fire, she felt her child stir beneath her ribs. A flutter, soft and uncertain. Her breath caught. She rested her hand gently over her belly and whispered, "You're still with me." She looked across the cabin. Silas sat in his usual chair, whittling something from pine, the shavings gathering like snow at his feet. His brow was furrowed, his eyes distant. She watched him for a moment before saying, softly, "Her name's going to be Mercy." His knife stopped. The room held still, as if even the fire waited. She felt the weight of his gaze before she looked up to meet it. His eyes were shadowed, stormy. That name had struck something inside him, something old and unhealed. She didn't apologize. She didn't take it back. "I think she's already forgiven me," Ruth said, placing a hand on her belly. "Maybe that's why she's still here." He turned his eyes away, back to the half-carved handle in his grip. But the knife didn't move. The shavings didn't fall. For a long time, he just sat there, unmoving, as though remembering something too painful to say and too sacred to let go. She didn't say anything more, and he didn't write another word for days. The first whispers began in the general store, where dry goods passed slower than stories. A fur trapper had seen a figure matching Ruth Ann's shape on the ridge trail, bundled in flannel and wool, walking alongside a man built like a tree stump. Couldn't have been Silas McCrae, someone said. He don't take women, don't take nobody. But the trapper swore by it, said he saw the girl laugh, said she carried firewood like she belonged there. By the time the story reached Elder Shirtliff, it was no longer a whisper, it was a firebrand. The girl he'd sworn was a liar and a whore was alive and thriving, nestled in the mountain's arms like some frontier Eve, carrying her sin like a badge. And worse than that, she'd found protection. Not from the Lord, not from the church, but from Silas, the madman with blood on his hands and no God in his heart. Shirtliff stood at the front of the chapel the following Sunday, eyes gleaming with fury masked as righteousness. He raised his hands high before the pews and declared that Ruth Ann had bewitched the hermit, that she'd seduced him with lies, tempted him with her body, and hidden her child of shame under the cloak of wilderness. He claimed the girl belonged to the town, that she was still his responsibility, that she must be returned before she spread her poison to others. Some believed him, most didn't speak up. But when he promised to ride out and retrieve what was stolen, he didn't ride alone. 3 men joined him before nightfall. Jeb Clancy, whose debts were steep and whose soul was shallow. Tobias Finch, a man quick to spit and quicker to blame. And Caleb, Ruth Ann's brother, still humiliated by the scandal, still too weak to believe his sister over the man who baptized him. The 4 of them gathered in the barn behind the chapel, oiling rifles and sharpening blades meant more for show than use. They spoke in clipped tones, avoiding the word posse, but everyone knew what it was. A reckoning, an ugly one. By lamplight, word spread through the town like dry grass catching spark. Shopkeepers leaned over counters, whispering guesses. Children eavesdropped behind flour barrels. Old women folded linens with tight mouths, remembering darker times. The town had seen madness before, but never like this, never with the church at its heart. Some said the girl had cast a spell, others said she was a fool. But a few, quieter still, remembered the look in her eyes when she'd spoken the truth. How she'd stood alone in the chapel, trembling but unmoved. How her voice hadn't wavered when she named the man no one dared to name. They remembered, and they watched. But they didn't stop what was coming. By the time the men mounted their horses, torches packed in saddlebags, the air had turned thick with a heat that didn't belong to August. It was the heat of judgment, riding north toward Bitterroot Ridge, and it carried with it fire, not the kind that warms, the kind that burns. The knock came just after noon, a slow and deliberate tapping against the cabin door. Ruth looked up from the basin where she was washing cloths, her hands dripping with cold water, her heart quickening. Silas was out hunting rabbits. No one else ever came this far. She moved to the door cautiously, her fingers resting on the latch. When she opened it, the cold wind carried with it the scent of saddle leather and pipe smoke, and behind it stood a man wrapped in a patched black coat, a brimmed hat low over his brow. One eye was clouded white, the other sharp and steady as a hawk's. "I reckon you're Ruth Ann," he said, voice low and graveled, like stones in a creek bed. "I'm Reverend Abel Gray. Is not relive." She stepped aside without a word, motioning him in. He nodded in thanks and entered slowly, his joints stiff with age and the climb. In one hand, he held a satchel. In the other, a walking stick made from twisted pine. He paused by the fire and sighed softly as he took in the warmth. Then he set the satchel down on the table and opened it. "I brought bread," he said, pulling out a still warm loaf wrapped in linen. "Some boiled eggs. A small flask of clean water, baptism water, from the springs below Zion's Ridge. Thought you might want that more than a sermon." Ruth stared at him, unsure what to make of it. "Why are you here?" "Because I believe you," he said simply, meeting her eyes. "Always did. Didn't say it when it counted, and that's on me. But I'm saying it now." A silence fell. Ruth's throat tightened, but she said nothing. There was nothing to say that could undo the weight of silence already past. He glanced at her belly and smiled, not the pitying smile she was used to, but something quieter, full of awe. "She kicking yet?" Ruth nodded. "Sometimes at night." He nodded back. "That's good. She knows her mother's strong." She turned away, biting her lip to hold the sudden heat rising in her eyes. When the door creaked open behind her, she didn't need to look. Silas was home. The preacher turned. "Brother McCrae." Silas stepped inside, his eyes narrowing at the visitor. He didn't speak, but Ruth could feel the storm beneath his skin. Abel raised both hands slightly. "Not here to scold, not here to spy, just to speak what needs saying." He looked at Ruth again, then back at Silas. "You may think this girl wandered up your ridge by accident, but I tell you, plain God, don't deal in accidents." Silas said nothing, only set down the brace of rabbits and began cleaning them with steady hands. Abel continued, "You've carried grief like a stone in your gut. That cradle in the corner, I know whose name used to be sung into it, and I know how deep that silence cuts." His voice softened. "But the Lord doesn't send you the same soul twice. He sends you the chance to become something new." Ruth turned toward him, brow furrowed. "You think I'm here to heal him?" Abel shook his head. "You're here to heal each other. And that child?" He touched the cross at his throat. "She's not just your sorrow's end, she's its beginning. This girl's not just for healing," he said, voice steady now, eyes locked on Silas. "She's for rebirth." Silas didn't answer, but he stopped gutting the rabbit, just held it in his hands, staring at the empty cradle beyond the firelight. And for the first time in weeks, Ruth saw something new in him. Not fear, not anger, hesitation, and maybe, beneath it all, hope. The climb was steep, the trail narrow and cut sharp into the mountainside, half swallowed by pine and snow. Silas didn't speak as they walked, his stride slow enough for Ruth to follow, but never turning back to check on her. The air thinned as they rose, and the trees fell away to craggy rock and wind-whipped grass. Ruth clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, more from the weight of the moment than the cold. She didn't ask where they were going. His silence was the kind that had direction, not aimless, not cruel, just inevitable. When they reached the ridge, the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the valley below. Silas stopped near a narrow ledge, then stepped aside to let her pass. At first, she saw nothing, just rocks, lichen, and frost. But then her eyes caught the shape. A flat stone, upright and carefully chiseled, half covered in moss. Not a gravestone from a churchyard, but something older, more personal. She stepped closer, kneeling as the wind tugged at her hem. The carving was rough, but clear. Miriam McCrae, daughter 1859. Ruth's breath caught. She was 19, Silas said behind her. His voice wasn't soft, but it held the wear of too many years spent trying not to use it. Went into labor early, blamed herself. But it wasn't her fault. Ruth rose slowly, turning toward him. "She bled too fast," he went on. "I tried. I did everything I knew. We didn't have a doctor. Just me. Just these hands." He held them out for a moment, broad, calloused, nicked from years of labor, hands that had built cradles and split wood and now trembled ever so slightly in the fading light. "They died before dawn," he said. "I wrapped them both, buried them myself." Ruth wanted to speak, but no words came. The wind filled the silence. "They said it was my doing," Silas continued. "That I'd brought down punishment. The women, her sisters, they said I hadn't prepared right, that a man couldn't birth life. Maybe they were right." His jaw clenched. "So I left, came up here, took nothing with me but what I could carry." She stepped closer, heart aching. "Never touched another woman," he said. "Never wanted to. Till you came knockin', half dead, full of pain." She blinked. "I didn't come knockin'." He gave a faint, hollow laugh. "No, you didn't." Silas looked at her then, truly looked. The pain in his eyes wasn't for himself, it was for her, for what she reminded him of, for what she carried, for what she risked. "You are not her," he said, "but I can't lose another." His voice broke on the last word. It wasn't a confession, it was a plea. Ruth stepped forward and reached out, not to hold him, but to rest her palm on the stone. The cold of it grounded her. The weight of his past settled into her own breath like a second heartbeat. "I'm not her," she said softly, "but I ain't leaving either." For a long time, he stood still. Then he knelt beside her, removing his hat. The wind whispered between them, and the stone glowed in the last of the sun. A grave, a memory, and beside it 2 living souls, praying for something they couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but maybe, just maybe, a second chance. The snow softened first at the edge of the creek, where the water ran fast enough to resist the freeze. Then it receded from the trees, exposing patches of dark earth, and finally from the cabin roof, sliding off in heavy, wet sheets that hit the ground like dropped quilts. The air smelled different, less like iron and ash, more like thawing bark and pine needles soaked through with sunlight. Spring was coming slow and reluctant, like a child being woken from sleep but coming all the same. Ruth felt it too, deep within her. The baby shifted more now, no longer fluttering but rolling, stretching against the walls of her body. She placed Silas's hand on her stomach one morning as he passed her the ladle, and without looking at her, he paused long enough to feel the kick. He said nothing, but later that day, he built her a stool by the fire so she didn't have to kneel to stir the pot anymore. They spent mornings together outside now, where the wind no longer cut to the bone. Silas taught her how to set snares for rabbits and how to recognize the deeper paw prints of mountain cats. He showed her where to stack stones to funnel game and how to keep the traps clean of scent. "Animals don't trust what stinks of fear," he said. She watched him closely as he moved, and in turn, he watched her never close, never with hands, but with a quiet attention that made her feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with judgment. When she asked to learn how to use his rifle, he didn't argue. He just handed it over, checked the safety, and said, "You only fire when it's life or death, and not before." By the second week of melt, the earth was soft enough to dig. Together they built a fence around the cabin yard, marking out a space for a garden come summer. She held the stakes while he drove them in. As he worked, shirt sleeves rolled up and jaw clenched in effort, she leaned against the fence post and grinned. "This for keepin' wolves out?" He didn't look up. "For keepin' you in," she laughed, half startled by it. "That so?" Silas straightened, leaning on the post with one hand. "Ain't sayin' you'd run, just sayin' I'd notice if you did." Ruth turned away before he could see the heat rising in her face. The truth was, she had stopped measuring time by her belly and started measuring it by his silence, how it shifted, how it warmed, how it broke in moments when he thought she wasn't listening. At night, when the fire was low, she sang lullabies under her breath, old songs her mother used to murmur while sewing. Soft, mournful tunes threaded with scripture and memory. One evening, Silas hummed along off-key and quiet, but unmistakably trying. When she looked up at him in surprise, he shrugged. "Doesn't sound right in my throat," he said. "Sounds like home," she whispered. Outside, the last of the snow cracked and melted into the dirt, and inside, a warmth neither fire nor spring alone could explain began to take root slow and steady, the way all lasting things do. The birds stopped singing first. Silas had spent enough years alone in the mountains to know what silence meant. Not peace, danger. He paused mid-swing, axe poised over a fresh log, eyes narrowing toward the ridge where the trail curved up from the valley. The trees still swayed, the wind still whispered, but something else moved beneath it, too careful to be deer, too loud to be fox. He set the axe down quietly, reached for the rifle, and climbed the slope just high enough to see through the trees. 4 men, on foot, steady pace, torches held high, though the sun hadn't set. One bore a coiled rope over his shoulder like it was his badge. Their coats were town-made, clean, stitched with pride, but their eyes were hard, hollowed by purpose. Silas didn't need to see their faces to know who led them. Elder Shirtliff walked with the certainty of a man who believed God backed every step. Beside him, 2 others followed, men Silas didn't recognize, but he knew their type. Hired help, scared hearts behind loud mouths. The 4th man lagged slightly behind, face turned away. But Silas saw the way his shoulders hunched, the way he carried shame like weight. Ruth's brother. Silas moved fast. No noise, no hesitation. He returned to the cabin and barred the door with one swift motion, then turned to Ruth, who stood near the fire, washing clothes in a basin. She saw his face and straightened. "What is it?" "They're comin'." Shirtliff, 3 others. Ruth froze, her fingers clenching the wet fabric. "Here?" He nodded once. She reached for her shawl instinctively, covering her belly like a shield. "My brother, he's with them, isn't he?" Silas didn't answer. He moved to the corner, retrieved the rifle, checked the chamber. "You stay inside. Don't open that door unless it's me or the fire's on the roof." Ruth stepped forward, voice trembling. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her, and the fury in his eyes wasn't wild, it was cold, measured. No girl belongs to a man who names her sin. She stared at him, the words sinking deep. She nodded. When the men reached the clearing, Silas was waiting near the garden fence, rifle slung loose in his hands but not raised. The torchlight flickered across his face. Shirtliff stepped forward, smiling like a man who thought himself patient. "Evening, Brother McCrae," he said. "We've come for the girl. The church calls her back." Silas's jaw tightened. "She ain't property." "She's a sheep," Shirtliff replied, "and I'm her shepherd. Shepherds don't tie nooses for lambs." The elder's smile slipped. "She bears fruit of shame. You harbor her, you take part in her lie." "I seen lies," Silas said. "They don't cry themselves to sleep and sew patches in my coat." One of the men stepped forward, reaching for the rope. "We can do this quiet, or we can do it loud." Silas raised the rifle slightly. "You won't do it at all." The man hesitated. Shirtliff's eyes narrowed. From inside the cabin, a window shutter creaked open. Ruth stood behind it, visible now, her face calm but pale. She placed one hand on her stomach and the other on the frame. "I ain't going back," she said. "You don't get to call me lost when you're the one who put me out." Her brother lowered his gaze. The standoff held like frost on spring soil ready to break. Silas didn't blink. "You best leave while the mountain's still quiet." And this time, Shirtliff saw it, the fire in Ruth's eyes, the steadiness in Silas's stance. Whatever hold he'd once had was broken. The rope was never thrown. The torches burned down. And slowly, wordlessly, the men turned back down the trail. The mountain watched them leave. And Silas stood guard long after their shadows were gone. The air was heavy with dust and spring heat, the kind that settled into the collar and made a man sweat before he'd even drawn a breath. Ruth stood just beyond the tree line, the old pine ridge rising behind her like a dark wave. Below her, the clearing brimmed with tension, 5 men with rifles, their hands too tight around the barrels, eyes darting between each other, waiting for someone to say the word that would make the first move right. And in the center, standing tall like the trunk of the oldest oak, was Elder Shirtliff. He was dressed in his Sunday coat, though it was Thursday. The gold pin of his office glinted sharp against the sun, and the Bible he held looked heavier than it had in chapel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone worked like a sermon, sharp-edged, lined with the false certainty of the righteous. "She's bewitched you all," he said, calm as a man ordering bread. "A girl filled with lies and sin. We all heard her accuse me without evidence, and now you follow her into the wild like she's the burning bush." The men murmured, not quite agreeing, not quite resisting. Ruth stepped forward. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't raise her voice. She stood in the clearing, belly round with mercy's weight, face pale but steady. Her hands were at her sides, trembling just enough to show she was still human, still afraid. "She's not a lie," she said. "She's a child." Shirtliff scoffed. "And I suppose you still claim she came from anything but your own wickedness?" Ruth looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then, in the open air, her voice rose not loud, but clear. "I told the truth," she said. "You came to our house when my father was away. You stayed longer than you should have. You touched me. I said no." Silence fell, like snowfall. "My mama said I must have misunderstood. But I didn't. I didn't misunderstand the blood. I didn't misunderstand the bruises. And I didn't misunderstand the way you threatened me after." One of the younger men shifted uneasily, lowering his rifle just an inch. Ruth stepped further into the clearing. "You cast me out, said I was wicked. But what kind of man blames a child to save his own name?" Still, Shirtliff stood unmoved. "You've poisoned this town," he growled. "And that man behind you, he's a beast, hiding behind grief." Behind Ruth, Silas emerged from the trees, his boots silent on the moss. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. He walked forward until he stood beside her, tall and still as the mountain that raised him. Then, from the woods behind the gathered men, another voice rang out. "Let him who is without sin," said Reverend Abel Gray, emerging slowly, his coat tattered from travel, "cast the first stone." Every head turned. The old preacher looked tired, dust-covered, but his one good eye burned bright. "I've heard enough sermons about shame," he said, stepping between the rifles and the girl, "but never one about justice." The men stood frozen, the spell breaking in slow cracks. Ruth's brother looked at her, eyes full of something softer than guilt remorse. He lowered his rifle to the grass. Ruth exhaled. Silas placed one hand lightly on her shoulder, not to guide her, not to claim her, just to steady her, and the mountain watched, silent and unmoved, as the tide began to turn. No one spoke as the last of the echoes faded across the clearing. The wind rustled the tops of the trees, but the men stood like they were carved from stone, caught between belief and doubt, tradition and truth. Reverend Abel Gray stepped forward, his boot pressing gently into the soft spring soil. In one hand, he held a leather-bound book, battered at the edges, pages bulging with damp and years. He raised it high enough for all to see. "This," he said, voice rough but steady, "ain't the good book, but it speaks of sin just the same." Shirtleff's expression didn't change, but his hand twitched slightly at his side. Gray opened the book, flipping carefully past a series of pages, until he landed on one marked with a frayed ribbon. "Ledgers from the town council," he said, "years' worth. I spent 3 weeks reading them in the cellar of the chapel after you sent the clerk away. Thought you'd buried it well, Elias. But God sees what's hidden, and sometimes so do the stubborn." He turned the page. "Payments to silence families, reassignments of young girls from your care, funds missing from church coffers marked charity, redirected to legal accounts that never saw daylight." One of the riflemen, a wiry man named Malcolm who ran the mill, shifted uncomfortably. "You sure about that?" he asked. "You got proof it's him?" Gray held up another paper, a faded receipt bearing Shirtleff's full name, signature unmistakable, signed and sealed, dated 3 months before Ruth was cast out. A hush fell deeper than before. Ruth stood motionless, her face unreadable, but her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her shawl. Behind Gray, a young deputy stepped forward, Jonas Reeve, barely old enough to shave, but known for his steady hands, and a father lost to town politics years before. He held out a pair of iron cuffs, voice quiet but resolute. "Elias Shirtleff," he said, "you're under arrest. Theft of church funds, obstruction of civil complaint, and unlawful threat against a citizen." Shirtleff turned to him, eyes burning, but no words came. Whatever scripture he might have called upon seemed to wither in his throat. "You touch me," he growled finally. "You turn this town against its own." The deputy didn't flinch. "We already did," he said. The sound that followed was subtle, like a breath exhaled in unity. One by one, the rifles lowered. Ruth's brother, eyes rimmed with wetness, let his fall last. He looked at her not in defiance this time, but in apology, and took a step back. Silas remained still, a statue beside her, but Ruth felt something shift in the ground beneath her feet. The weight was lifting. Not gone, not forgiven, but seen. Gray closed the ledger and handed it to Jonas. "You can't plant a harvest in spoiled soil," he said, "but you can dig it up, start again." The men said nothing, but no one followed Shirtleff when Jonas bound his wrists and led him toward town. Ruth watched him go, and for the first time, he did not meet her eyes. His power had lived in silence, and now it had none left to stand on. The trees didn't cheer, the wind didn't rise, but the town, at last, began to see. The chapel hadn't held so many people since the flood of '53, when the pews were used as makeshift beds and the pulpit doubled as a grain bin. But on this spring morning, every bench was filled. Children sat on the floor beneath their mothers' skirts. Old men leaned forward with cracked hands on knees, and the preacher stood at the front, one hand resting on the open Bible, the other on the town ledger. Silas stood at the back. He hadn't been in a church in 20 years, not since he buried Miriam, not since the whispers drove him into the hills. His coat was worn, his boots dusty from the ridge, but he stood straight, shoulders squared, eyes unmoving. Ruth sat 2 rows from the front, flanked by the preacher and her brother, whose head hung low. She looked neither proud nor afraid, only steady, the way a woman looks when she knows the truth has been told and cannot be taken back. This meeting, Reverend Gray began, was called not for punishment, but for peace. You've heard the truth, you've seen the ledger. What remains is choice. Will we return to what we were or walk forward together? A murmur moved through the room. 2 matters stand before us, the preacher continued. Whether Ruth Ann is welcomed back into the town as one of us, and whether Silas McCrae, formerly exiled, now protector, may remain, not as a shadow in the hills, but as a man among neighbors. The town clerk, a stooped man with a wispy beard, stepped forward and unrolled a list. We'll take voices one by one. Silence settled. Then a hand rose. Old Mrs. Whitlow, who sold herbs from her porch and hadn't spoken in public since her son died in the war, stood slowly. Her cane trembled as she walked toward the front, eyes fixed on Ruth. She carries a child of light, she said, voice thin but unshaken. You can't birth mercy in darkness. That girl's done more for this town's soul than half the sermons I've heard. She turned, looked straight at Silas. And he's no beast. He's what a man should be. Noted prices. No one laughed. No one sneered. Then another voice. Let him stay. And another. She's one of us. One by one, they rose, not all, but enough. The farmer who once ignored Ruth at market. The midwife who treated Silas as animals when no vet would climb the ridge. Even young Deputy Reeve, eyes bright and hopeful. The votes were counted. Clear and final. Ruth could return. Silas could stay. The clerk looked to the preacher, and the preacher to the belfry door. The rope was pulled. The chapel bell rang once, low and long, rolling across the valley like thunder in summer. The children looked up. The elders closed their eyes, and Ruth, hand resting on her belly, exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside, the mountain stood unchanged, but below it, the people were beginning to look different, a little softer, a little braver, a little more like a community redeemed. The path home felt different now. The same stones, the same bends in the trail, but the silence wasn't watchful anymore. It was peaceful. When Ruth and Silas crested the last rise and the cabin came into view, its roof dark with melted snow, smoke curling gentle from the chimney, it didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a beginning. They unpacked slowly, without words. Silas unrolled the new tools the town had gifted. A clean saw, a sturdy hammer, nails wrapped in cloth. Ruth carried in the quilt Mrs. Whitlow had sewn with her own hands, patches stitched with little roses and tiny script that read, "Mercy endureth forever." The next morning, Silas cleared the corner near the hearth where the old cradle had once rested under hides. He didn't uncover it. He didn't speak of it. He simply took up his knife and a thick block of pine and began again. His hands worked slower this time, not because of age, but because of care. Every curve was smoother, every joint tighter. He carved stars along the edge, 5 of them, one for each month Ruth had lived beneath his roof. He didn't say so, but she counted. While he worked, Ruth found a can of whitewash and a handful of brushes left by the preacher's last visit. She moved carefully, belly rounding like a harvest moon, steadying herself as she painted small verses in looping script above the lintels and across the beams. "Perfect love casteth out fear," she wrote above the front door. "Blessed are they that mourn," over the hearth. When she reached the back wall, she hesitated. Then, in smaller letters, she added, "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee." Neither of them commented on it. But later that night, Silas placed the new cradle beneath those words. They built a second chair next. The first one had always been his, a simple, solid thing with a creak in the left leg. Now he made one for her, smoothing the armrest to fit her smaller hands. He didn't ask her opinion, but she noticed he shaped it just the way she curled her knees when she read by the fire. She painted a small flower on its backrest, a daisy like the ones that bloomed low in the valley. Then came the soil. Together they turned it, breaking the crusted top layer with shovels, hands, anything they had. Ruth knelt slowly, pressing seeds into the earth, squash, beans, a row of early cabbage. She smiled as she worked, pausing each time Mercy kicked, whispering, "We're planting you a world." Silas watched her from the fence line. He had built the gate stronger now, not to keep her in, but to keep what mattered close. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, 2 chairs side by side, the cradle waiting inside. The sky stayed light longer, and the wind smelled like thawed grass. Ruth stitched tiny booties by hand. Silas whittled toys from cedar. Mercy was near. The whole cabin knew it. Every board, every beam, every wall bore the quiet expectancy of new life, not just hers, theirs. The first pain came with the thunder. Ruth was stirring stew when it struck, low and sharp in her belly, like a taut string pulled too far. She froze, hand resting on the wooden spoon, breath hitching. Outside, the wind shifted, rising from a whisper to a steady howl through the trees. Clouds bruised the horizon. The storm was close. The second pain came faster, deeper, a bloom of fire in her hips. She dropped the spoon and gripped the table, heart pounding. Her water broke in a quiet rush against the floorboards. Silas was at the woodshed, splitting kindling. When she opened the cabin door, leaning on the frame, rain already flecking the air, he turned at once. "It's time," she said, voice thin but steady. His eyes sharpened. No panic, just motion. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides, caught her as she staggered, and eased her into the chair by the hearth. Then he crouched, his hand over hers. "Stay warm. Stay still," he said. She nodded, teeth gritted. "The midwife." "I'll bring her," he said. "I'll bring her fast." He saddled the horse with practiced urgency, mounting even as the rain thickened into sheets. As he turned down the path, the first lightning bolt split the sky, carving the ridge in a flash of bone-white light. Ruth watched him disappear into the trees, the storm swallowing him whole. Inside, the wind moaned through the cracks. The fire popped. Another contraction tore through her like a river breaking its banks. She cried out, gripping the quilt Silas had laid across her knees. Blood warmed the hem of her dress. Too much. She sank to the floor, knees tucked beneath her, back against the cradle. Her breaths came fast now, ragged and uneven. "Lord," she whispered, "don't let her die with me." Her hand found the edge of the cradle, the one he'd carved with stars. She pressed her forehead to it. "Please, mercy's all I've got." The storm raged louder. Thunder cracked the sky in 2. A branch slammed against the roof and rolled down the slope with a thud. Ruth screamed through another wave of pain, her body folding in on itself, tears streaking down her cheeks. The world narrowed to fire, breath, blood. Then the door burst open. Silas stumbled in, soaked through, hair plastered to his face. He held the midwife in one arm, Mrs. Whitlow, shawl-drenched, eyes fierce beneath her bonnet. They reached Ruth together, the old woman dropping to her knees, pulling cloth from her bag, checking her pulse, murmuring instructions Ruth couldn't hear. Silas hovered behind, helpless, eyes wide. She reached for him, fingers slick with sweat, and he knelt beside her, one hand cradling her head, the other clasped tight around hers. "You're not alone," he said. "Not this time." She cried into his shoulder, the pain cresting again, her body trembling. Outside, lightning struck the ridge. The cabin shook. But the cradle stayed standing, and so did Silas, anchoring her through the storm, refusing to let go. In the space between thunder and breath, they held fast. And mercy pushed closer to the world. The storm had passed by morning. The rain gave way to silence so complete it made the world feel reborn. Outside the cabin, the earth steamed softly beneath the rising sun, and the trees stood dripping and still, their branches heavy with what had been endured. Inside, it was quiet, but for one sound, a sound unlike any the cabin had known in many long years. The crying of a newborn. Ruth lay back against the piled quilts, her hair damp, her skin pale but glowing in the firelight. Her chest rose and fell with exhaustion, but her eyes stayed open, wide and locked on the bundle in her arms. She cradled the child close, whispering words only the baby could hear. Words shaped like gratitude, like prayer, like a mother's promise. Silas stood nearby, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to breathe the same air. His shoulders were hunched, his hands limp at his sides, as though he no longer knew what to do with strength now that it wasn't needed. The midwife, her sleeves rolled and hands still red from the work, stepped back from the basin and dried her arms. Her face, lined with years and stories, softened as she looked at the scene before her. "She's strong," the woman said, and loud. "That's a good sign. There no—" Ruth smiled weakly, brushing her thumb across the baby's cheek. The child's cries had faded to small hiccuping breaths, her face pink with newness, fists clenched and twitching near her chin. She looked up at Ruth with cloudy, uncertain eyes, already searching for something. "I named her," Ruth said, voice hoarse. Silas looked up then, finally, a flicker of fear and hope caught in his throat. "Her name is Mercy," Ruth said, "because that's what she is." He stepped forward slowly. Ruth lifted the baby slightly toward him. He knelt beside the bed without speaking and looked down at the child in her arms. For a long time, he didn't move. He only stared, as if afraid she might vanish the moment he acknowledged her. Then a breath caught in his chest. "She looks like Miriam," he whispered, so quiet it was barely sound. The mouth, the eyes. Ruth didn't flinch. She only watched him, eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall during the night. "But she's not," he said, blinking hard. "She's her own." His hand rose slowly, hesitating midair, then gently came to rest on the edge of the blanket. He didn't touch the child, just the fabric, but it was enough. His shoulders shook once, then again, and the first tear broke loose down his cheek. Mrs. Whitlow, watching from the corner, nodded once and said, "She's yours too, Silas. Don't be fool enough to deny it." He didn't argue. Ruth reached out with her free hand, found his, and held it. The fire crackled. Outside, birds began to sing again. And inside the cabin that had once held only sorrow, a new cry rose, soft and curious. Mercy had come, and she was staying. By spring, the garden was no longer just furrows in the earth. It was green with life, thick with the scent of promise. Rows of peas climbed thin stakes, cabbage leaves unfurled like open hands. Early blossoms danced in the breeze. The soil, once stubborn and frozen, now yielded gladly to seed and sweat. It had taken root just like they had, slowly and without fanfare, beneath a sun that felt warmer than it had the year before. Mercy sat in the middle of it all, propped between straw bundles and humming to herself, hands slapping the earth in curious rhythm. Her laughter echoed across the slope like a creak in melt, bright, unexpected, insistent. Ruth knelt beside her, pulling weeds with one hand, while gently keeping her daughter shaded with the other. She smiled each time Mercy squealed, each time her tiny fingers curled around a beet stem or reached for a sunbeam like it might be caught. Inside the cabin, the fire was low but steady. Books lined the shelf now, worn pages full of scripture and story, of lessons and lullabies. Ruth read to Mercy every evening by that fire. The little girl nestled against her breast, eyes wide, mouth open in silent awe. Sometimes she gurgled at the sound of familiar words. Other times she drifted to sleep before the second page. Ruth never minded. Each reading was its own kind of prayer. Silas had taken to carving again, not just cradles or chairs now, but toys. Simple animals from cedar blocks, spoons with flowers etched into the handles, a set of wooden blocks with letters burned into each side. He taught Mercy to hold one in each hand, to knock them together and laugh at the sound. And though she didn't yet understand what he was showing her, she watched him carve, wide-eyed and patient, like she knew the shape of his soul was written in the shavings that fell to the floor. He made her a bird one day, a sparrow with wings stretched mid-flight. Ruth found it tucked in Mercy's quilt at bedtime. When she held it up, Silas only nodded. "She'll fly someday," he said, "but not yet." They took meals outside now, on the flat rock beside the cabin, Ruth with Mercy in her lap, Silas handing her slices of bread, buttered thick. The air smelled of pine and new grass. No torches had come up the mountain since that night. No footsteps but their own had disturbed the trail. And then, one morning, while the sun was still low and the garden still damp with dew, the bell rang, low and far, drifting up the ridge like a distant voice calling home. The chapel bell. Ruth looked up from her reading. Silas paused mid-carve. Mercy reached into the air, as if she could grab the sound and hold it. It rang once, Twice. A third time, long and sure, Silas closed his eyes. "It's for us," Ruth whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The bell didn't mark judgment anymore. It marked belonging. It said, "Come back," not "Stay gone." It said, "You're part of this," not "You don't belong." They had come through fire and snow, silence and shame, and now, in the cradle of a valley that once turned its back, they were whole, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by mercy.